This is Beyond Species, a podcast exploring issues around speciesism and the struggle to dismantle it. In this episode, we hear from Tash. Tash is a vet nurse studying environmental sciences. We learn what a plant-based food system might look like and some of the challenges facing it. Tash sees vegan permaculture as a workable solution that can be done on large scale. We also hear from Tash about some of her experiences as a vet nurse and some thoughts on activism. If you want to start then by telling us about your activism.
Yep. So I started doing activism about about a year and a half ago, maybe a bit longer. I went vegan possibly around 2 years ago. So then I pretty much kind of went straight into activism. The first thing that I attended was a chicken vigil at Moy Park, which I'm sure many people will have actually been to that vigil. It's one of the bigger ones that people go to. And then from there, it kind of just spiraled onto being, I got involved in other things such as some direct action. I've been involved with Extinction Rebellion as well at some point, and more recently, briefly, with Animal Rebellion. And I've been to like the usual kind of protests and marches, like the march in London. So yeah, that's where I'm up to at the minute.
Okay. Actually, just while we're on vigils there, what's your thoughts on vigils?
I think, yeah, I do think they're really important. To some extent, I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because for some people, it can like completely change their worldview. It can be like a gateway into other activism. For other people, it can be quite off-putting and can actually put them off doing any other activism. I do find. I think for me, it was a gateway into other things because it just made me realize how real it was. All these things I'd heard about, in terms of how bad we are treating animals and the exploitation. I think it really brought that into reality for me. So I found it quite important. But going forward, I don't know, what whether it'll be something people will continue to do or whether it'll kind of die out a bit. I'm not sure.
Hmm. Do you still go to vigils then?
So my last one I went to it hasn't been this year, I don't think. I think it was towards the end of last year, but I didn't go to as many in the last few months really as what I was prior to that.
Okay. And you're studying at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm doing a degree in environmental science, which I'm actually able to do from home, which is good. So that's something I started about a year and a half ago, so I'm about halfway through now. And then yeah, I'm doing that alongside my work, so it's a really really good degree. I've learned so much through doing it, and especially it does mean animal agriculture does come up as one of the problems quite regularly throughout my degree. Yeah.
You're a vet nurse by day.
I am, yes, yeah. So, I went into vet nursing when I was about sort of 17, so I've been doing it for a few years now. Definitely a challenging job role to have, particularly being a vegan veterinary nurse within practice. So whilst there are many kind of aspects of it that are like really rewarding, I do think basically being vegan within practice is really difficult as you see quite a lot of disconnect between certain species. So you do really see speciesism taking place within practice. So I would say, yeah, that one of the biggest difficulties I've had with that is that one day we were nursing a chicken within practice and we were really taking good care of her. And then the same vet who was helping me treat that bird was then on lunch eating the same species of animals. So I do really struggle with the disconnect. I like how I've been able to have a positive impact on the animals that I've treated and worked with. I do like that aspect of it, but it's certainly a very challenging job role with the view of believing that animals should have rights. It's certainly very challenging. I'm lucky enough now that I currently work with a couple of anti-speciesist people, so together we have a bit more of a voice in how things are going in practice. But if I was on my own, I think I'd definitely struggle a lot more. And even in previous job roles, I have worked with vets who actually go and shoot or hunt on the weekend, even within fox hunting at my first practice. So certainly really hard to work with those people. But yeah,
Wow.
very
That
challenging.
is a challenge. There's so many different things in there that I want to pick out. So I'm not surprised at all that, there's vets that hunt and that the disconnect between
Hmm.
helping a chicken and eating a chicken. I
I
mean,
know. Yeah.
so I wonder about vets and cognitive dissonance. Do you
Hmm.
think there must be so much more cognitive dissonance, or maybe the vets that you've met, did they start out really wanting to help animals, really loving animals, and then maybe they were a bit naive, and then as they studied, that the studying is a kind of indoctrination, do you think? Or
Yeah, so I'd say I've seen two types of vets. So I've seen vets that go into it just because um it's not even really well paid, to be honest. But I mean, as in it's just quite a challenging profession. They're really intelligent people. They're just interested in medicine, really. And then I've seen people that are really passionate about animals as well. I would say that those people, I think, do come under quite a lot of challenges in university because they are taught in a certain way, I suppose, like you say, like almost an indoctrination that farm animals are taught treated in a certain way, sorry, and then small animals are treated differently. I do think that that's quite the dialogue that goes through uni, really. So yeah, I don't know, it's really hard to say. I think a lot of them do care about animals, but I do think that their perspective does change by the end of
mm,
university, unfortunately. Yeah, I would say that
mm.
is true.
And you said that there's a few of you there now
Yeah.
that are anti-speciesist, and you've maybe been able to
Mhm.
have some kind of impact. Can you give any
Yeah.
examples of changes that you've been able to make, or what you mean by having a voice?
Yeah. So, yeah, I can't go into like massive detail. However, we have
Hmm.
had a couple of cases where stray animals have come in and they've been given, a set amount of hours, and then potentially after, if no owner comes forward, the wrong decision has been made for that animal, as in their life's been terminated because we haven't been able to find a home, and it's considered a burden on the practice. Whereas now we have changed the policy, so that isn't the case now. And we are able to keep them for a lot longer and then move them on to proper rehoming centres. And the people that I work with who are anti-speciesist, we have got very specific ideals about where that patient will then go on to be rehomed from there. So we are quite firm about that as to where they go, and also wildlife as well. I think we now give them a lot more chance to be rehabilitated than perhaps what was happening there before.
Yeah,
So yeah,
well, that's
because
good.
yeah,
That's a proper change in the right direction, at least, isn't it?
it is. Yeah, slowly. It's not obviously everything we want it to be, but yeah.
Yeah, but working within that kind of framework, there's not much you're going to be able to change, but at least you've been able to move something in the right direction.
Yes,
So,
yeah, and
yeah.
hopefully we can reach that into other parts of practice. Obviously, we are limited as it is a private practice, but anywhere we can, we do try to implement,
Mm,
positive change. Yeah.
okay. And you said that wildlife is also taken in.
Yeah, so we get a lot of wildlife brought in, particularly through spring. As you can imagine, we have a lot of birds, like fledglings, that have fallen out of their nests and got lost. Often they are brought in for kind of reasons that aren't really necessary. So people will find them and worry and bring them in when perhaps they were actually having their parents come and feed them. So there's difficulty there, but
Mm,
essentially, I am able to take some of those animals on when I know how to treat them. If they do have more specific needs, then I try to ensure that they go to a wildlife specific hospital. But if I can provide them with care and help at home, then I will end up taking some home. I have hand reared quite a lot of pigeons, for example, and taken care of quite a few hedgehogs as well. So, yeah. Mm.
pigeons and hedgehogs.
Yeah.
So, on your degree, then, obviously with the climate crisis, I guess
Mhm.
that is quite a topic that's discussed quite often on the course.
Yeah, definitely
Yeah.
is.
What are the views on animal agriculture then?
Yeah, so this is something that is mentioned as I've sort of noticed throughout the degree. It is mentioned, but it to different degrees. So, within one module, for example, it will kind of be almost swaying you towards being plant based, and yet in another module written by a different lecturer, it will have a different view of, oh, there's a better way of doing things. We can use animals in a so-called better way that is better for the environment. So I do think there's different narratives there as we go from kind of module to module, but there is acknowledgement that it isn't what we should be doing, especially in the face of the climate crisis. There is acknowledgement that farming animals is not sustainable, particularly in the ways that we are doing that at the minute. But yeah, my degree has covered so much, and there is a lot of quite clear entanglements between human life and the natural world, as we always sort of act as though they're completely separate to each other and they'll both kind of exist separately and carry on. But you see so many entanglements from one to the other. Nothing we really do can go without impact, and nothing the planet does can go without impact to us. So that is a kind of thing I've noticed particularly.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be differing views, I suppose, amongst the academic circles about what the right way forward is, and you're never always going to get just one right way, I suppose. But is the main theme that animal agriculture can be made sustainable?
Yes, I would
Hmm.
say that that is the main theme, that it's a lot more that than it is, go plant based. I think a lot of them are going on about sort of small scale farms and about how it's what we now refer to, I suppose, as factory farming that is the problem rather than using animals in general. So that is the overhead theme, I'd say.
Yeah, I wonder about this because we often hear from UK farming that they like to play the whole local thing. They like to say, well, we can reduce carbon emissions by certain ways, but it always still involves exploiting the animals. And they talk about like eating local and buy British and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, they
but
definitely do.
the reality would be, considering that the UK has so many factory farms now and that the market for meat is so huge, that if they were to try and take a step back and move away from factory farms to these small holdings or whatever, these smaller operations, ultimately the farming industry would lose money anyway because they wouldn't be able to supply the quantities at the kind of efficiencies that they've been able to with this, capitalist method of doing things. So I
Yeah.
think they're just making up like stories to kind of paint a different picture when in actual fact I don't think they have any intention of doing that, of moving backwards or smaller.
Yeah, I get that impression as well. I get that it's more about the advertising and the presentation to consumers than it is actually an intention of change. I do not see how, if people are that set on eating animals, that we would be able to do it in a sustainable way with people eating them as much as what they do. So I think even if the farming industry had the intention of possibly going back to that kind of way of farming, I think there would have to be a huge reduction in the amount of animals that people were consuming. And I just don't think that I don't know. I don't think that that's our
Mm,
intention at all to actually switch to that anyway.
no,
Yeah.
no, I don't think so. Um, I was reading something the other day, and it was saying that some of the biggest chicken facilities in the UK have. I'll double check this figure, but I'm pretty sure the biggest one was 1.7 million chickens.
Wow.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
so many. And like, if you think about it with the chickens, you get these comparisons of like the kind of the effect on the environment, I suppose. And red meat's always like really, really bad, and milk's really high and stuff. Then you've got lamb, and then you've got pork, and then chicken's kind of always at the bottom because it actually is, in terms of the meat production, um, chicken is. really low impact
Hmm.
compared to the others, but that's only because they can just cram them into these, okay, fair enough, massive sheds, but you can actually fit so many animals into such a small space.
Yeah, yeah, you definitely can. And I think the industry, in particular with chickens, is trying to streamline it as much as possible. So I think their intention is that in a couple of years, that the amount of feed that per bird that they get, they end up producing that much weight in meat itself. So they're basically saying that the same amount of grain will go into the bird as what the protein will be produced from the
Mm,
chicken themselves.
right.
So they're trying to streamline it to try and reduce those arguments against that, that industry. I
Yeah.
think is something that's going on at the minute. Yeah.
Yeah, they're good at finding efficiencies,
Hmm.
unfortunately. Um, so, in terms of sustainability, then, what do you think would be like a realistic outcome in terms of plant based farming?
So there's quite a few things I think we'll see more of in the future of plant-based farming, whether people eat more plants or whether we stay the same, just because at the moment we're not able to produce what we need to, and I think we're going to have problems with soil going forward. I think some of the solutions that we will see will include hydroponics, so like growing plants within water tanks inside. I think we'll see a lot of vertical farming. There's a lot of debate as to whether these methods are actually sustainable, but I do think this is something people are beginning to invest in more. My personal take on it has always been that we need to go back to actual farming and ecosystem ways, such as permaculture, which is obviously what I'm really interested in. But I do think that there's going to be a lot of investment in kind of, yeah, vertical farming, warehouse
Mm,
farming, that kind of thing going forward.
mm,
Yeah, I do think that
okay.
that's something we'll see more of.
So, tell us more about permaculture then.
Yeah, so it's hard to kind of go through as much as what I'd like to in this short space of time, but and also when it comes to giving a definition for permaculture, I've always been told if you get 100 permaculturists in one room, they'll all give you a different definition,
Okay.
because there's so much to say that it's like hard to shorten it down, but essentially permaculture is permanent agriculture. So it's a way of setting up an ecosystem of farming that does actually behave as an ecosystem rather than one type of plant. And it just adheres to several principles and quite a
Mm,
few ethics as well. So there's three sort of main ethics that you might have heard of to do with permaculture, which is kind of to provide earth care, human care, and fair shares, in the way that you try to give back to the earth, just grow what you need, and try to ensure that nobody goes hungry. So there's quite a lot of emphasis on food justice, and earth justice as well within the permaculture ethics, really. Um,
mm,
but yeah, so there's quite a lot of techniques as well that people use. So some of them have stemmed back to indigenous techniques that have been used for thousands of years. Obviously, we know that many of these communities have got a lot of knowledge and an amazing relationship with the land. So some of what permaculture principles and their techniques will do is to kind of use what these people have been doing for thousands of years. And also, there's other methods in there like regenerative principles, to try and rebuild soils, certain irrigation systems that work really well. It's kind of a big, yeah, it's like so many things going into permaculture. It's kind of hard to kind of sum it up.
mm. Okay.
But it's all organic, and it's very kind of against the use of fertilizer and pesticides. So it's very in tune with nature and
Hmm.
working with her rather than against her.
Mm.
Yeah.
It sounds really good. It
Hmm.
sounds like is there a difference between that and agroforestry, or does agroforestry fit into that somehow?
It can, yeah, it comes into it, yeah. So, a lot of the work that I did in my permaculture project within the summer was to do with building creating food forests, and
Mm,
agroforestry. So, again, I suppose animal agriculture put the spin on it that you can do that with animals, but you can also do it without, and it works really well.
mm,
But yeah, that would also come in, within under the permaculture name, really.
okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
So with permaculture, um, the the things that I've seen on it, it generally tends to include animals. I don't know if I've seen like stuff that's quite dated, or but there's usually animals in the mix somewhere because their waste products
Yeah.
can be used as fertilizer and things like that. Are animals still quite included in the permaculture picture, do you think?
Yeah, I would say that that is the mainstream permaculture ideal, is that you'd expect to have animals within the system. And whilst there are becoming more and more vegan permaculturists, I'd still say that they're met with some kind of scrutiny and like, people are quite skeptical of the idea that you can do it without animals. Um, but I have seen systems that do work without them, and they work perfectly fine because there are sort of alternatives that those vegan permaculturists are using instead of kind of, waste products from animals, for example.
Hmm.
But I would say that you would meet some resistance if you were, I guess, I don't know, because they've been doing it for so long in that way, but they would probably say, oh, it can't be done like that. But I have seen examples of them without,
Mm.
yeah, that animal use.
Okay, can you give us an example then of um, how some different parts of this little ecosystem that would fit together, so we can get an idea of how it might work?
Yeah, so what you can do is you can grow plants in different sizes. So for example, you can grow as we mentioned before, like agroforestry, you can have trees, so you can have like an orchard in one part, and then beneath them you'd have plants that thrive in the shade, which are then also adding nutrients back into the tree, etc. And what you tend to do with permaculture is you'll have plants that will grow quite, recover quite quickly, that you can take from daily, and you have those close to your house. And then as you go up further and further away from your house, you'll have plants that will grow kind of more slowly, essentially, so that you're always able to go out, and if you were just feeding one house, for example, always go out and collect that food that you'd need for that day. But certain plants will grow together really well, so you can get like companion plants that
Hmm.
one will release, I don't know, more phosphorus, and that's what that other plant beside it needs, and one will provide more shade, and that's what, that's the kind of conditions the other plant needs. So there's a lot of that. A lot of it is quite old knowledge, but it can be, a lot of people still hold that knowledge, and it can be revived.
Mm.
um but yeah, so it all works really well, and you can use and allow sort of animals that are wild to kind of utilize the system, because even them playing their parts of their lives can actually really contribute. So birds, for example, them, eating the seeds of
Hmm.
the fruit from a tree, and then depositing the seeds elsewhere in their droppings, that can really like benefit the system. So it's still encouraging like wildlife within the
Mm.
system and working in that way. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what sounds ideal to me right now then is like a vegan permaculture sanctuary.
Yes. Yeah. That would be
That would be
that would be the
great.
dream as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I don't know
Uh,
if yeah, I don't know if there are any, because I'd recommend them to anyone listening, but I don't know if there are any that have a sanctuary with them as well. Um,
mm. That yeah, I think that would be something that would be really interesting to look into. If there are existing sanctuaries
mhm.
that could benefit from some kind of input from someone who knows something about permaculture and kind of rewild the land. I mean, I'm sure a lot of sanctuaries do have some wild land anyway, but
Yes. Yeah.
just to kind of, it sounds like it's the way to restore the earth to how it should be, because nature had all this stuff worked out.
Mhm.
Nature knew like ecosystems work because uh, all the parts interact properly. It's only when we came along and kind of turned things into
Yes.
monocultures and slashed forests and all this kind of thing, that
Which
things
has
started
only
going.
really
Yeah.
recent, yeah, really recent,
Mm.
development, because before we were using more of these traditional methods, maybe not in the way that nature intended, but more like it than what we are currently.
And so renewable technologies, then things like solar panels and wind power, I guess that would fit into this picture as well.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, and obviously, it depends what kind of future people would want. But if we wanted any kind of modern future, or anything like what we're living now, we really need to transition to renewables if we are able to kind of sustain that lifestyle. A lot of permaculture places that I have been to do use small scale renewables on their land. So they'll have like a small turbine or whatever, and they're able to generate some electricity. But yeah, it is very much linked that you would kind of, a lot of these people have got dreams that they would be able to completely sustain themselves from the land with their own renewables, etc.
Hmm.
Involved in that as well.
Mm. So it sounds like this kind of system would work on a small scale for like maybe a couple of people or a small community. And obviously, we've got a lot of people to feed on the planet.
Hmm.
Um, is this something that could be scaled up enough to feed everyone?
Yeah, so I, as ever the optimist, do believe that it could, it could be something that could be scaled up. So there are some projects in America, for example, that are doing this on quite a large scale and are feeding quite a large amount of people from their land. I do think to some extent it would depend on the quality of the soil you have existing and the climate you have existing in that area, but there are some projects that have higher crop yields than what they would if they were growing monoculture crops, for example. So they're actually getting a lot more off the land than if they were to be doing it in that way, and that's something to be spoken quite highly of, because that's quite a challenge to be able to produce that in an organic way, but I have seen it being done. um but yeah, so I suppose I'll be able to tell you a bit more later in the year about that. But yeah, there are, like I say, there are projects that are going on in the US and in the world where they are able to feed a lot of people. So I am positive
Mm-hmm.
and, well, optimistic really, that there is something we could do that would be able to
Mm-hmm.
feed the world, and yeah,
Yeah,
in
I
this way.
think, I mean, I think it would be possible because whenever I start looking at how would we get out of this climate mess, it seems to me that it comes back down to, with capitalism, everything's being centralized. And what we need to do is actually start breaking things down again because, I imagine a lot of different smaller communities that are networked and helping each other
Hmm.
when needed. So one community might have certain resources that the others rely on, and you kind of trade things that way, but not
Hmm.
requiring the capitalist who takes everything, all these resources, into their big, massive warehouses and then processes them and sends them out again. It's more about bringing the power back to people. And if people
Yeah.
can think more, you can see what's going on in your local area. You can um, work with uh, a few hundred people in your own community, and I feel it's so much more human in a way that we're able to know what's going on and be involved with our neighbors and things like that, and working the land amongst us. Almost, I guess,
Hmm.
cooperative working would be kind of like a transition, maybe away from capitalism towards that, or maybe different cooperatives.
Yeah.
There's so many different ways, I guess, you could do it if you look at different kind of anarchist ways. But
Hmm. Yeah.
something's got to, this kind of uh, capitalists resource plundering is just that's the thing that's causing the crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is. Yeah. And I think, as you kind of mentioned there, I think, being able to reach out to your community, I think is really important. I think we have almost lost that in more recent years. I think that if you were to ask a lot of people, they wouldn't actually really know their neighborhood, and I think that's something that's really quite sad. And I guess it's because we're living such like individual lives where we're rushing around all the time, and it's very capitalist kind of life that we're living, really, that we don't always have time to reach out to our neighbours. So I think there's almost something in the social aspect that'd be like quite important to recapture as well,
Hmm.
of being able to help each other and get to know each other
Yeah,
again.
absolutely. Just yeah, you know, just getting to work together to feed yourselves. I think
Hmm.
there's so much power in that, and that's where the food justice things comes into it. If you can make sure that everyone in your community is getting fed, and if you've got control over the means of that farming, rather than relying on supermarkets, I just think there's so much
Hmm.
there that we could explore, and it's a real key to moving forward. And actually, as things get worse and supply lines become disrupted, and we're in late stage capitalism anyway, I think things are breaking down. So we might as well just start rebuilding these communities now.
Yeah, and I think kind of it's the easiest way to get power back to the people. I say that it's still, there's still challenges
Yeah,
there, but I think to some extent it's one of the easier things that you can do from home. And it's almost like the first thing of step of resistance, isn't it, to be able to grow your own food and remove yourself from paying into that system that is so exploitative in many ways. So I do think it's, if you are privileged enough to have the land and have some kind of resource, I do think it's a really good way of the first step of resistance to do. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. It is. It's yeah, growing food as a first step of resistance. I like that.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
actually while we're talking about what you can do at home. That's quite interesting. Is there anything that can be done on a really small scale? So, say I've got just a front lawn. I guess it depends on soil quality and stuff like that, right? But is there more that we could be doing in our homes to kind of start doing this kind of thing with growing our own food?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously the challenge of, like you say, if you've only got a small access to a small space of land, you won't be able to grow all that much in a sense to be able to sustain yourself. But there are things that you can do, and if you were able to share that food with others and then them be doing the same thing, you could eventually end up with quite a good source of food. So things that you can grow in your garden that are relatively like low maintenance are sort of fruit bushes, really good for wildlife as well, providing natural habitat. You can actually grow some kinds of mushrooms quite easily as well. There's
Okay.
vegetables like perennials, that kind of thing. But I do think if we were able to build, again, go back to the community thing, if we were able to reach out to our neighbours and each grow different things, you'd end up having quite a good source and a good connection with other people to be able to share
Hmm.
food.
Yeah.
So I do think, yeah, that's quite a lot
Hmm.
of power in that.
Yeah. And the way I see it, what would be great is everyone's growing bits of food, and then there's also a bit of communal lands that people can tend to and things, and there's also a
Mm.
community kitchen where people can cook the food and anyone can go along there and eat. So if you happen to be someone in the community who's kind of struggling a bit financially or whatever, so that everyone's always getting fed, that thing of coming together and eating food together, I think, is so powerful as well.
Yeah, once again, I think it is something that we've lost. I don't really think that that's something you'd come across very commonly anymore, and it's a real shame.
Mm,
I think it's almost like there'd be a shock of like, oh, what, eating with strangers. And yeah, I think it's such a, every time I've experienced that, I've had such positive experiences from it. It's been, something really good. So I think, if we can get back to that in any way of rebuilding communities and spending time with them, we'd actually be pleasantly surprised at how much we
mm,
have in common with other people.
absolutely, yeah. So going back to the permaculture then, I take it then that vegan permaculture is probably quite a small minority, maybe seen as a kind of little niche movement within the wider permaculture diaspora, I suppose.
Yeah, it is, but like I say, it is kind of growing. So there are people now that are daring to kind of do their own thing and see how it goes, and they've had really good results. So the place where I did my learning and my training, that was a completely vegan permaculture site. They had really good success with what they were growing, and they also had like a herbal garden. They were able to grow quite a lot of resources in that way. So there are ways around it. I think obviously they say that the biggest barriers are things like not being able to have access to animal waste, and kind of they say, oh, the soils won't be turned over as much, etc. But there are ways around it. So like encouraging wildlife onto the land where they should be can actually turn over the soils, and you can actually get alternatives to using animal manure anyway. So you can use something called green manure, which is like a cover crop, and you can still rebuild soils in the same way that you would with animal manure. So there's still ways around it. There's also
Hmm.
quite a lot of challenges with using animal manure. So, say for example, if that animal has ever been unwell and they've ever had administration of antibiotics or anything like that, that can go back into the soils and it can last quite a long time and actually kill natural microorganisms in the soil. So there's quite a lot of negatives with using that kind of thing
Hmm.
anyway.
Hmm.
But yeah, there are ways
Hmm.
around it.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought that animal manure was so important to
Mm.
agriculture because is it still used a lot in kind of big animal ag, or is it just fertilizers and things that they use?
I wouldn't say it's commonly used as much
No.
anymore, no, because I suppose you can buy the chemical version and it's much more highly concentrated. So I would say it's not commonly used
Okay.
anyway, really.
Yeah. So, but in like a lot of permaculture setups, because it's a smaller setup, they would want to incorporate the animals and I guess get a lot more um, from. Yeah, they need a supply of manure, right?
Yeah,
I guess it's kind of like an easy thing for them. It's kind of that thing about the animals are will eventually some of the animals will be eaten, but while they're
yeah.
here, they're providing manure and they're eating waste food and stuff, I guess.
Yeah, and there's definitely the viewpoint of, oh, well, they're having a lovely life because of the setup of the garden and the land, and there's very much that it's all very idyllic. There's still that kind of viewpoint in permaculture, I'd say.
Yeah. You've been involved in, I think you mentioned Extinction Rebellion and Animal Rebellion then. So, Extinction
Yeah.
Rebellion's climate justice, really. So, that's obviously something you're quite keen on being involved in, yeah?
Yeah, so I think I went to their first ever meetup day, so I was involved very early on with Extinction Rebellion, and then I kind of haven't done as much more recently. But yeah, it was all very much that I couldn't really see any other movements that were working in that way that I could have as much of an impact as what they were seemingly having at that time. So yeah, I was very involved with them. I think I went to their first sort of week of action as well, and more recently, I briefly attended Animal Rebellion as well, and that
Mm-hmm.
happened in October.
And what do you think in terms of the climate justice movement? Are we getting places?
Huh. It's hard to say because of the greenwashing thing. So I suppose a lot of companies make out like they're being creating positive change because they're under so much pressure from the public, when actually it's not positive change. It's just covering up things in like a nice, shiny coat of paint, whatever. But they're not actually making change. I'd say that I suppose the climate emergency announcement was a big step. But then it very much depends on the government to act on it. And as of yet, we haven't seen any changes. And we're still, bypassing all our goals of our, CO2 release. Really,
Mm,
like all our kind of outputs haven't really reduced. So there hasn't been much of a reaction
mm,
or, anything taking
mm.
place from the announcement.
Yeah, and there seem to have been quite a few of these like climate summits and things, that Greta Thunberg will show up at, I just get the impression that these politicians and people in suits are just completely like willfully ignorant. I don't know what they're talking about, but they're not talking about what needs to be done, clearly. I
No,
don't get it.
no, they're not. No, and I guess a lot of it will be put on like like each individual as well, and I think they kind of
Mm,
ignore the fact that people high up in government are getting quite a lot of money out of fossil fuel industries, and there's a lot of behind the scenes shaking of hands on deals. There's a lot of
mm,
things going on that kind of explain why there might not always be action, especially from the government side of it. I do think when it comes to like the IPCC and that kind of thing, I do think although they are genuine climate scientists that want change, but then they're just being held back by the lack of governmental action, basically.
mhm,
But yeah, I don't. It's so
mm,
frustrating to see, what's going
mhm.
on, and then such a little response.
Because I have
It's
seen, I don't know who's,
devastating. Not even.
yeah, I mean, it's, and obviously in the UK, we're kind of lucky as citizens because we're not really feeling the effect. I mean,
Hmm.
we're not suffering as much as a lot of people are in
Hmm.
the world from the climate crisis yet, but
Hmm.
ultimately everyone's going to be affected.
And I think that's almost it, that injustice and the inequality of how the effects of climate change are carried out is almost one of the reasons why we're not acting on it. I think if it was all happening in our backyard, we'd be a bit more
Mm,
like we need to actually act on this. Whereas you can turn a blind eye to, other places in the
Mm.
world that are more heavily affected, just
Yeah.
because it's not visible and we can't supposedly
Hmm.
see it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So, you mentioned greenwashing there. There's a lot of talk about like a Green New Deal, and I get the impression that's what Extinction Rebellion are actually after, right? They would support a Green New Deal. They think kind of we need businesses and industry on board to be able to create the new, like all the new green tech to get us out of this mess.
Hmm. Yeah, I'd say that they would support that to an extent, but even within XR, there's so many divisions. So I'd say a lot of people actually want a completely different future to that. But I suppose when you're trying to be realistic as to what you can achieve, I guess they just think that would be the second best thing is to
Mm.
have this green transition into,
Hmm.
living the same way of life but in a better way.
Yeah, it's kind of that thing about you either break the system and create something brand new or
Hmm.
reform the system.
Yeah, yeah, it
Yeah.
definitely is.
So it's a difficult one. I mean, I don't think capitalism can be reformed. We need a whole new way of thinking. Really, it's an ideology, really, isn't it? Capitalism.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and as I've said to you in the past, there are some massive dangers with green capitalism and with greenwashing, of us being convinced that our choices are better, just
Mm,
because of the way that they're being presented to us, when actually the oppression is just shifting from one species or community to another one,
mm,
and it's never really completely breaking the cycle, really. So, our clothing lines, for example, we're being told that the fabric's changing, all being produced more sustainably and whatever, but still in the background, there's still all those exploitative systems going on, and
mm,
mass consumerism will never be sustainable no matter what we're
mm.
using.
Yeah, that's it. I think we have to. Well, in the West anyway. I can only speak for kind of what I know around in the UK and Europe, but yeah, we need to start unlearning our consumerism in a way.
Hmm.
Like just start doing with what should I say? Start doing with less. Trying to figure out how the best to say. Yeah,
Yeah.
get used to having less. Get used to wanting less. Um, and there's some moves towards that, and I know a lot of it is pushed back onto consumers, and obviously our choices do matter. But there's such a you don't see the corporates really making significant changes. Like, for example, plastic in supermarkets.
Hmm.
th- there's there's been a handful of small changes. Like, I don't think that there's less plastic in my local Tesco now than there
No.
was 5 years ago.
No, and I almost don't think there will be in, like, in another few years. I don't really think
Mm-mm.
it will change, because they say, oh, we've switched to this material. It's another kind of form of greenwashing. They say, oh, we've switched to this new material, but it's still unnecessary, basically. But
Mm-hmm.
it's just so ingrained in the way that they process food, I suppose, that it's,
Mm.
yeah, it doesn't seem to be breaking.
Yeah, it needs to be a total rework of the whole food system.
Yeah,
That's the only thing that will
yeah,
really change things. Yeah.
yes, definitely.
Okay, so speaking about changing the food system, actually, Animal Rebellion are kind of that's their thing, isn't it? They want a plant-based food system. That's their demand, right?
Yes, it
If
is.
I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken. Yeah. So, do you think um, have they got like a have they got a kind of strategy in place or suggestions of how that might happen, or is it just like almost like a symbolic demand of we need change, we need a plant-based food system, which is also okay, but I just wondered if there was anything more to it behind the scenes.
So yeah, when I was working quite closely with them, there was a strategy. It didn't really go on much more than potentially just a couple of years, really, of the transition. But there was quite a set strategy. But whether that's changed anymore, so it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't really a symbolic demand. It was kind of supposedly backed up. But I did quite a lot of research for them, so I was trying to look at what a plant-based system would look like in the future.
Mm.
So I guess in a way, at one point, I was kind of the forefront of what we needed to do. I didn't end
Mm-hmm.
up carrying on with that role, but we were kind of looking at
Hmm.
how it would look and then how to get there. So there was some
Mm.
form of strategy there.
Okay. Can you give us an idea then of what it might look like?
Yeah, so we it's obviously really difficult, isn't it? Because I think if you were to say overnight, oh, plant-based system, I think the whole country would be in a riot basically. But
Yeah.
the things I was looking at were kind of things I've included, sort of mentioned earlier. So helping, and as well as helping farmers to actually switch from animal-based farming to plant-based. So there's a few examples in, again, America where they've helped convert these animal based farms into plant systems. So we were looking at that. We were looking at vertical farming, hydroponics, all of that. Um, Basically, every single way that we'd be able to reduce air miles and be able to create enough food within the UK to feed everybody. And what we did actually find is that we would be able to feed the whole of the UK, I think, on something like a third of the agricultural land that we have available. So it would be
Mm.
possible. But obviously, it'd be quite a radical change to what we would be.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah,
That's what we need though, a radical change,
yeah,
you
of
know, that,
course.
that
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
what it has to happen. It's just that the government doesn't want that because business and government are profiting off, the way things are at the minute.
Yeah. Yeah, and it
Yeah.
is, as we've said, quite a hard thing to break. I think it's particularly become noticeable to me at kind of how many backstage things are happening with people shaking hands. For example, like our local MP runs a massive pig farm and industrial unit within Worcester,
Mm.
and he is actually an MP. So I think I've almost seen that happening on other scales as well. So even within the main government, I have heard of that. So
Mm.
I think there's obviously those ties.
Yeah. Yeah, the meat industry really have got their hooks
Yes.
and they've had, I mean, they've had so long to do it, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
And
yeah.
they've got so much money, and yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. And I guess a lot of MPs, especially the conservative ones, come from rural areas,
Mhm.
um, traditional backgrounds. I'd put it like
Yeah.
that. They're probably quite uh, linked into farming. I was glad to hear though that Animal Rebellion had done some real work on that. Some having some practical steps backed up, so this isn't just so that people can't say, well, yeah, how are you going to do it? Or, well, we don't really know. Instead, say, actually, well, here's some ideas. Okay, it's never going to be necessarily, you're not going to have the solution straight away, and it's going to change as you go along. But I think in the animal rights movement, what we don't do very well is provide practical solutions. Not that we should be the ones making the changes, but it would be
Mhm.
good to say, well, instead of doing this, you should do this.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about permaculture is that it is a solution to some extent and to some problems. So even with, kind of capturing carbon and that kind of thing, there's just solutions in place. So I do think
Mm.
that is something that we need to have a think about, like you say, more within the animal rights movement.
Hmm.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I guess within Animal Rebellion, I was lucky enough to work with really good scientists actually that done a lot of studies on how much land we'd need, what resources we'd need to be able to support people, a huge
Hmm.
population on a plant-based diet, and they had quite a lot of information on it. So there's a lot of research going on in other areas, within universities and things that perhaps we could benefit from looking at.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's good. That's encouraging then. Um, okay, so whenever I discuss animal rebellion with someone, I always bring up the thing about the police.
Yeah, I was about to bring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, how did you find the animal rebellion stuff went when you were taking part?
Yeah, so really, really good bunch of well-meaning people. I don't think that they would have ever done anything that they did in the way that they did if they knew the kind of problems it could bring. Um, but yeah, so there was quite a few things that I noticed, which one of them was that in the morning, the police that had been trying to arrest people overnight and hadn't been protecting us from potentially dangerous situations were chatting to the Animal Rebellion members, just, really casually, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to do what I've seen them do a million times and get as much information out of them as they could. And people weren't really aware of the risks and were just, quite happily talking to them. And then obviously that developed into actually singing to them, and kind of saying about how we're all on side and we should be in alignment with them, etc. Which understandingly and rightfully so caused a lot of outrage within the animal rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I did
Yeah.
struggle with that at that point. I wasn't even there. I just had to leave because I was like, I don't understand how this is happening.
Mm-hmm.
And especially because the police weren't even trying to hide their disdain. They were literally just like laughing at the people in the crowd, and quite happily arresting people every few minutes. So there was no,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't even like they were even trying to act as though they were on side. So I don't understand how it went on as long as it did.
Mm-hmm. And where was this? Was this at the meat market?
So
The first action, or?
yeah, so the thing where I saw a lot of people talking to the police was at the meat market, which was when they had allowed us to have quite a few problems with the people working there. And then at the time when I think everyone was chanting and singing was when there'd been quite a few arrests at Defra. So
Mm-hmm.
a friend of mine had kind of gone ahead and kind of done a lock on Defra, had been arrested, and then people were singing, "Oh, we love you, police," etc. Um, to the police, and they were literally just, yeah, they couldn't stop laughing. They just thought the whole thing was ridiculous themselves, and I was like, I don't see how
Mm-hmm.
this gives us any credibility, and b, how this is standing in solidarity of people that have been affected by the police system. I
Yeah.
really struggled. I spoke out about it a couple of times, and I was told that we're all human beings, etc. But I was like, but you have to look at the history of the state, and I don't know. Yeah,
Wow.
my
Yeah.
viewpoints weren't really listened to on that.
No. Um, I think obviously since then there's going to be another rebellion, isn't there? In I think it's May is the
I
Extinction
believe
and Animal
so.
Rebellion.
Yeah,
Yeah. So since then things have moved on quite significantly. Obviously the Tory government has like certainly sealed the deal on getting their hands around everyone's throats, and
yeah.
they're basically cracking down on terror laws. And there was recent news that there's an animal rights activist who's in jail, who's been told that they're also going to be considered under these changes to the terror laws, that they could be kept in jail for longer than was originally planned
I
because
have
they're deemed
heard.
a terrorist. Yeah.
Yeah, I have heard that. I didn't have the opportunity. I only saw it earlier today. I didn't have the opportunity to
Mm.
properly read through it, but yeah, I did hear that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I would expect that in the next animal rebellion that they will have learnt from these criticisms of how they've handled the police thing, and they'll
Hmm.
look at the situation in the UK at the moment and realize it is a very unsafe place to be an activist,
Yeah.
and that in no way should you be condoning any kind
Hmm.
of appreciation for the police. And when you get arrested, this is me having a little rant, by the way. I'm just kidding. When you
Mm,
get
go for it.
arrested, don't fucking smile and make a fucking laugh out of it.
Yeah, yeah, I know. And
Yeah.
it was almost like not really with Animal Rebellion because we didn't have as many people, but especially with XR, it was get as many people arrested as we can.
Mm,
That was actually one of the goals at one point, to try and literally fill every single prison cell, which they did succeed in doing in the entire of the UK. There
mm,
was no more cells left. And I don't think people were really taking it into consideration, I suppose. I don't know, the effect, the
mm,
psychological effects, etc. The fact
mm,
that we were giving them our personal details for actions that weren't really always changing things. So
mm.
people were getting arrested on. I think there was one action within Extinction Rebellion where people were painting things on the wall, painting their hands red, and handing themselves into the station. Just,
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw about that.
I saw
Um,
the
and
flyer
it's
for it.
just,
Yeah.
yeah, and it was just like, if you are going to get arrested for a good cause, you would want it to make change before you start giving all your details to the station and making yourself known
Mm-hmm.
to them. Yeah.
It just seems to me to be such a counterproductive way of activism to actually, right at the start, make it one of your main goals to hand over
Yeah.
all your activist details to the police by
Hmm.
giving yourself up for arrest. It's like that you should want to stay incognito as long as possible.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is you'd want to get as much done, and then it would only be when you really can't back down and you want to make a stand that you would allow that to happen. You wouldn't want it to be right. 'Cause some of them were, been there for 2 days, first activism they'd ever done, and were getting arrested. And I was just like, it's not really
Mm,
the right. I don't know. Currently, at that time, wasn't. I didn't think was the right thing, but it's
mhm.
their decision, of course. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, well, we'll soon find out in May, I guess.
Mhm.
What do you think then about the current state of play within the animal liberation or animal rights movement or vegan movement? I don't know what to call it right now, but
I
whatever it
know.
is.
Yeah, it's like two different things, isn't it? Yeah.
Mm,
So I would say that we had some really good success from the action that I unfortunately couldn't attend the other week, but the direct action everywhere. I'd say that that was a really positive thing that's happened
mm,
recently. So that was like, I think they stuck to their messaging really well. I think they had a really good outcome from that. I'd say there's a lot of kind of people don't really know where they stand in terms of it being vegan movement, animal rights. I think it has become a bit of a divide in other respects. So I'd say there's still a lot of unfortunately, hero worshipping. I hate to say it,
mm.
but going on. And I think a lot of people are what we would all say are more like plant-based than they are about animal rights. So I think going forward in actions that we do need to stick to that clear anti-speciesist messaging rather than go vegan for like a temporary basis, if you know what I mean. So we need to like make it clear that
Yeah.
we don't consider them commodities, etc., and that they
Hmm.
are who they are and individuals. I think that needs to be quite a clear message that we have
Mm,
going forward.
hmm.
But yeah, yeah. What do you think?
Well, I would agree with you on that DXE action. And just for anyone
Hmm.
listening who doesn't know what we're referring to, this was DXE action in the UK. Where was it again? I know it was in England, but somewhere down south.
It was. I don't think it was Kent, but it might not have been far. I
Right.
don't know if it was
Yeah.
around that area.
Okay. So south of England. And I think so. I mean, the best thing that happened is that actually the activist walked out with 50 liberated chickens with agreement from the farmer.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
right?
yeah. They
Yeah.
agree. They agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was one of their demands that we'll leave, but we're taking chickens with us. And I don't know if we've seen that in the UK before, other than on a large scale anyway, other than at the Meet the Victims Northern Ireland, which was a few weeks before that, where they liberated a pig with permission of the farmer.
Yeah. I
Hmm.
think those are the only two accounts I've heard of that actually
Mm.
ever happening.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure there's been negotiations maybe that you haven't seen on social media
Hmm.
back in the past
Yeah.
and things like that. But in terms of these kind of these walk-ins where people go in, and it used to be just get some footage, um, and stay there till the media gets there. And obviously, liberation would be one of the ideal things, but it hasn't happened until these two actions. Uh, if anyone's listening and I'm wrong, please let me know. But I think so. In a way, I see progress in that because
Hmm.
that's two occasions where the farmers have gone, yes, okay. Are there any other things that you can think of that have happened that have made you think, yeah, that's good, that's progress?
Well, I think the start. I haven't really seen any of the actions they've done as of yet, but I think the start of this 2020 group. I don't know if you've seen about
Hmm.
them. They've got
Yeah.
quite good messaging, and I think from what I can see, good plans. Good strategy for this year. Obviously, it's all behind the scenes currently, but I think that will be progress definitely. I
Hmm.
think there's things to be learned from XR and how many people they've got mobilized. So it's just whether we can get that to be done on the same scale, or not as much,
Mm.
but on a bigger scale than AR. But I do think there's a lot of recognition now, more recently, of kind of how anti-oppression is a must, and I think um, it is becoming more clear to people about the real meaning of veganism and being
Mm.
anti-oppression. I think that that's progress. I think that's
Hmm.
becoming more understood. It should have been a given all along, but you know what I mean. It's becoming more
Yeah, yeah,
recognized.
I know what you mean. I think that um, people are realizing it's political, which, like you say,
Yes.
it should have always been, and it always has been actually. Um, but yeah, I'll be the first to say that when I first went vegan, I didn't think of it as a political thing. I thought about it as my own ethical thing. I didn't want to contribute to that industry. But I'd never really been involved in politics before that very much, and I would say I was up to date with current affairs, but never really um, thought of myself as having an impact on politics in any way. So it took me a while to realize, and it was actually only when I started reading about anarchism that I started to realize what a mess the world is in. And it was actually anarchism that made me start thinking more about veganism in a political way. And I
Hmm.
suppose a lot of people have come into the vegan movement through, um, social media, YouTube stuff, diet, whatever.
Yeah.
This because it is mainstream in a way, and everyone knows what it is, and people in the UK anyway, everyone's talking about it, and it's kind of quite common for people to be, or for veganism to be talked about anyway.
Hmm.
But people coming in and not knowing the history of animal rights,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that's a problem. Is people need to start reading up and watching videos and trying to talk to people who've been involved in it for a while.
Yeah. I think that there's so much to be learned from activists that have got so much experience and that have been affected by the state, and I do think it is almost our responsibility to actually learn um from them, and I don't think we always take up the opportunities that we can. I think some of us, probably me included, are quite headstrong and, oh, this must work because it has to, kind of thing, or we've not
Hmm.
really like considered the full history. So that's something that only recently I've began to think about, is like the effectiveness and what's worked in the past, and like what have other people experienced and been through. And I think that's something that I'm only just recently starting to take on board.
Hmm.
I think we can all be quite headstrong and like, oh, this must be this way, it should work,
Yeah,
etc. I don't
definitely. I
know.
think because it's new to you, you think that the stuff that's happening at the moment is the stuff that must work. Whereas actually, people
Yeah.
have, there's been a lot of different social movements, and there's a lot you can learn from different movements. And this is the most frustrating thing I find when um, people aren't interested in, the people who are against kind of learning about other oppressions and things, is not only can you learn how to not be an oppressor or start undoing your own
Hmm.
privilege and so on, but you can also learn from the way other movements have done things. There's so
Yeah.
much there. So it's not like animal rights is just some kind of, or veganism is just some kind of like amazing new age, like convert the world into veganism really quickly sort of incredible movement. That's just it's got, there's so much we can learn from everything.
Yeah, I don't always think it is treated like a social struggle. I think it is just like you say, it's this speedy
Mm.
thing that we're expecting to happen pretty much
Hmm.
overnight. Because I guess we have that instant gratification thing, don't we, within a society where
Hmm.
we expect things to happen within a short space of time, and
Mm.
perhaps we haven't considered how long it's taken for other movements to achieve what they need
Yeah,
to.
that's a good point actually. Yeah, instant gratification, and it's the thing that every time you go to the supermarket or go into town, there's new vegan options and things like that. So it's really easy to think things are happening
Hmm.
quickly, and within the last few years in the UK, there have been a massive increase in vegan options. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, in terms of social change, most people still eat meat every day.
Yeah, and as we know, the numbers are going up for the
Yeah.
amount of animals being used within the system. Yeah.
Hmm. Absolutely. Um, is there anything else you can think of in terms of animal rights or veganism that you wanted to that you do you have a burning issue that you want to bring up or not?
Not really. Probably that we haven't covered already. I think quite a few people now are getting to be on the same page, as I've said.
Mm,
So hopefully, that can only be a positive thing. I have also seen a bit of a crossover from the climate justice movement of them taking more of an interest, realizing on their side as well that it's all linked.
mm,
So I think there's connections to be made there, and we need to be careful not to like rule people
hmm.
out when they could be allies as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is the people involved, a lot of the people involved in the climate justice movement, um, so they may want to reduce their meat intake or realize that we need to change or stop animal farming for environmental reasons, which at least makes them kind of open minded to listening to us talking about veganism and animal rights, right?
yes, yeah.
And it's that thing, there's that research that's been done that people who care about human rights are more likely to care about animal rights
Oh right, I
and
haven't
vice.
seen yeah,
Yeah,
haven't seen
I'll
that.
link it. I'll link it if I remember in the podcast. I'll send it to you. But yeah, it was done in America, and it looks at the states where human rights are more respected, also have better legal protections for animals and things like that.
That's really interesting.
And yeah, and people who believe more in human rights also believe more in animal rights. So and vice versa, unfortunately.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so there's that as well. So and also I think when we talk about like anti-oppression, linking human rights and animal rights and all the different types of oppression, I also think that really need to massively include the environment in that and climate justice because you know, even in terms of thinking of the earth as a living organism, and like you were saying, kind of at the start of this, um, is that everything is so connected and interlinked. You know, without the environment being healthy, we're not going to survive. So anti-oppression and like justice for everyone means justice for the earth and everyone living in it.
Yeah, and I think the Earth is treated like an inanimate object, and not she's not
Hmm.
kind of given rights for the rivers aren't given rights, for example. I did see an article, I don't
Hmm.
know where I saw it, about how uh I think a lot of people have been trying to fight for different elements of the environment to have their own rights,
Hmm.
to some extent, just because otherwise anyone is able to pollute that river, anyone is able to do anything, and it doesn't make a difference because I don't
Hmm.
know. It's really hard, but yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be considered. Is should there be rights? Should the Earth have the her own rights as
Hmm.
well?
Yeah, that's
Um,
really interesting. It is. It's kind of like, I think that's the direction we need to be heading in when we're asking for animal rights, is human rights as well,
mhm.
and the right for the land and the seas not to be polluted and used as a resource. And I guess ultimately that just comes down to again capitalism and getting rid of capitalism, which will always see every single thing as a resource and turn
Yes.
animate living beings like humans and non-human animals into um, inanimate things.
Hmm.
And then obviously capitalism looks at the earth as an inanimate thing anyway.
Yeah.
So we need to remind everyone that rivers and trees, plants, they're alive as well.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely. And I think, well, I don't know, just briefly touching back on what I've looked at in my degree, we have looked at kind of the commodification process and how that's been applied to a lot of elements of the earth and to animals. And it's quite a heartbreaking process to see how they become objectified and
Mm.
tried to be made there's just a lot going on there, and I think what they do to animals in the terms of commodification, I think, can be seen in the environment as well, I guess.
Mm.
um I don't know, it's kind of hard to explain, but it's definitely something
Yeah.
that I've been kind of interested in reading more about
Yeah.
recently.
Okay. And I mean, we touched on it earlier when we talked about like a vegan permaculture sanctuary, but can you give us a vision of what your ultimate like permaculture setup would be?
Yeah, so if it was on a personal level, I definitely know what I'd like for that, and I kind of have got a vision of what I'd like it to be like as well for everybody. But I certainly would, like land that people could kind of share from, live off, and also have animals have their safe space as well.
Mm.
I think the ultimate goal would be to have everybody utilizing permaculture ecosystems as, their main supply of a food source. And so I guess it's almost kind of that imagery of like what, I don't know, these fairy tales, and also like going back to like Garden of Eden, that kind of thing of
Mm.
basically just restoring justice in the world, really. It's
Yeah.
such a big vision to have, but it seems like such a simple thing of just everyone should have
Mm.
peace.